Welcome back to A Clock in the Journal. There are moments no man can command. No matter how steady the hand, how clear the mind, some outcomes are decided elsewhere, beyond planning, beyond skill. He knows the risks. He always does. But tonight, knowledge is not enough. The path narrows, the air tightens, and for once, control begins to slip away. Because when fate takes its place, even the sharpest instinct must wait and see what remains. "The worst of this war," said Raffles, "is the way it puts a fellow off his work. It was, of course, the winter before last, and we had done nothing dreadful since the early autumn. Undoubtedly the war was the cause. Not that we were among the earlier victims of the fever. I took disgracefully little interest in the negotiations, while the ultimatum appealed to Raffles as a sporting flutter. Then we gave the whole thing till Christmas. We still missed the cricket in the papers, but one russet afternoon we were in Richmond, and a terrible type was shouting himself hoarse with, 'Evie British Lorses, Orful Slaughter o' the Boers, Orful Slaughter, Orful Slaughter, Evie British Lorses.' I thought the terrible type had invented it, but Raffles gave him more than he asked, and then I held the bicycle while he tried to pronounce Eland's Lagte. We were never again without our sheaf of evening papers, and Raffles ordered 3 morning ones, and I gave up mine in spite of its literary page. We became strategists. We knew exactly what Buller was to do on landing, and still better, what the other generals should have done. Our map was the best that could be bought, with flags that deserved a better fate than standing still. Raffles woke me to hear the absent-minded beggar on the morning it appeared. He was one of the first substantial subscribers to the fund. By this time our dear landlady was more excited than we. To our enthusiasm for Thomas, she added a personal bitterness against the wild boars, as she persisted in calling them, each time as though it were the first. I could linger over our landlady's attitude in the whole matter. That was her only joke about it, and the true humorist never smiled at it herself. But you had only to say a syllable for a venerable gentleman, declared by her to be at the bottom of it all, to hear what she could do to him if she caught him. She could put him in a cage and go on tour with him, and make him howl and dance for his food like a debased bear before a fresh audience every day. Yet a more kind-hearted woman I have never known. The war did not uplift our landlady as it did her lodgers, but presently it ceased to have that precise effect upon us. Bad was being made worse and worse, and then came more than Englishmen could endure in that black week across which the names of 3 African villages are written forever in letters of blood. "All 3 pegs," groaned Raffles on the last morning of the week. "Neck and crop, neck and crop." It was his first word of cricket since the beginning of the war. We were both depressed. Old schoolfellows had fallen, and I know Raffles envied them. He spoke so wistfully of such an end. To cheer him up, I proposed to break into one of the many more or less royal residences in our neighborhood. A tough crib was what he needed, but I will not trouble you with what he said to me. There was less crime in England that winter than for years past. There was none at all in Raffles, and yet there were those who could denounce the war. So we went on for a few of those dark days, Raffles very glum and grim, till one fine morning the yeomanry idea put new heart into us all. It struck me at once as the glorious scheme it was to prove, but it did not hit me where it hit others. I was not a fox hunter, and the gentlemen of England would scarcely have owned me as one of them. The case of Raffles was in that respect still more hopeless, he who had even played for them at Lord's, and he seemed to feel it. He would not speak to me all the morning. In the afternoon he went for a walk alone. It was another man who came home, flourishing a small bottle packed in white paper. "Bunny," said he, "I never did lift my elbow. It's the one vice I never had. It has taken me all these years to find my tipple, Bunny, but here it is, my panacea, my elixir, my magic philter." I thought he had been at it on the road, and asked him the name of the stuff. "Look and see, Bunny." And if it wasn't a bottle of ladies' hair dye, warranted to change any shade into the once fashionable yellow within a given number of applications. "What on earth," said I, "are you going to do with this?" "Die for my country," he cried, swelling. "Dulce et decorum est, Bunny, my boy. Do you mean that you are going to the front?" "If I can, without coming to it." I looked at him as he stood in the firelight, straight as a dart, spare but wiry, alert, laughing, flushed from his wintry walk. And as I looked, all the years that I had known him, and more besides, slipped from him in my eyes. I saw him captain of the 11 at school. I saw him running with the muddy ball on days like this, running round the other 15 as a sheepdog round a flock of sheep. He had his cap on still, and but for the gray hairs underneath. But here I lost him in a sudden mist. It was not sorrow at his going, for I did not mean to let him go alone. It was enthusiasm, admiration, affection, and also, I believe, a sudden regret that he had not always appealed to that part of my nature to which he was appealing now. It was a little thrill of penitence, enough of it. "I think it great of you," I said, and at first that was all. How he laughed at me. He had had his innings. There was no better way of getting out. He had scored off an African millionaire, the Players, a Queensland legislator, the Camorra, the late Lord Ernest Belville, and again off Scotland Yard. What more could one man do in one lifetime? And at the worst it was the death to die. No bed, no doctor, no temperature, and Raffles stopped himself. "No pinioning, no white cap," he added, "if you like that better." I don't like any of it," I cried cordially. "You've simply got to come back." "To what?" he asked, a strange look on him, and I wondered, for one instant, whether my little thrill had gone through him. He was not a man of little thrills. Then for a minute, I was in misery. Of course I wanted to go too. He shook my hand without a word. But how could I? They would never have me, a branded jailbird in the Imperial Yeomanry. Raffles burst out laughing. He had been looking very hard at me for about 3 seconds. "You rabbit," he cried. "Even to think of it. We might as well offer ourselves to the Metropolitan Police Force. No, Bunny, we go out to the Cape on our own, and that's where we enlist. One of these regiments of irregular horse is the thing for us. You spent part of your pretty penny on horseflesh, I believe. And you remember how I rode in the bush. We're the very men for them, Bunny, and they won't ask to see our birthmarks out there. I don't think even my hoary locks would put them off, but it would be too conspicuous in the ranks." Our landlady first wept on hearing our determination, and then longed to have the pulling of certain whiskers, with the tongs, and they should be red hot. But from that day, and for as many as were left to us, the good soul made more of us than ever. Not that she was at all surprised. Dear brave gentlemen who could look for burglars on their bicycles at dead of night. It was only what you might expect of them, bless their lion hearts. I wanted to wink at Raffles, but he would not catch my eye. He was a ginger-headed Raffles by the end of January, and it was extraordinary what a difference it made. His most elaborate disguises had not been more effectual than this simple expedient, and, with khaki to complete the subdual of his individuality, he had every hope of escaping recognition in the field. The man he dreaded was the officer he had known in old days. There were ever so many of him at the front, and it was to minimize this risk that we went out second class at the beginning of February. It was a weeping day, a day in a shroud, cold as clay, yet for that very reason an ideal day upon which to leave England for the sunny front. Yet my heart was heavy as I looked my last at her. It was heavy as the raw, thick air, until Raffles came and leant upon the rail at my side. "I know what you are thinking, and you've got to stop," said he. "It's on the knees of the gods, Bunny, whether we do or we don't, and thinking won't make us see over their shoulders." Now I made as bad a soldier, except at heart, as Raffles made a good one, and I could not say a harder thing of myself. My ignorance of matters military was up to that time unfathomable, and is still profound. I was always a fool with horses, though I did not think so at one time, and I had never been any good with a gun. The average Tommy may be my intellectual inferior, but he must know some part of his work better than I ever knew any of mine. I never even learnt to be killed. I do not mean that I ever ran away. The South African field force might have been strengthened if I had. The foregoing remarks do not express a pose affected out of superiority to the usual spirit of the conquering hero, for no man was keener on the war than I before I went to it, but one can only write with gusto of events, like that little affair at Surbiton, in which one has acquitted oneself without discredit, and I cannot say that of my part in the war, of which I now loathe the thought for other reasons. The battlefield was no place for me, and neither was the camp. My ineptitude made me the butt of the looting, cursing, swashbuckling lot who formed the very irregular squadron which we joined, and it would have gone hard with me but for Raffles, who was soon the darling devil of them all, but never more loyally my friend. Your fireside fire-eater does not think of these things. He imagines all the fighting to be with the enemy. He will probably be horrified to hear that men can detest each other as cordially in khaki as in any other wear, and with a virulence seldom inspired by the bearded deadshot in the opposite trench. To the fireside fire-eater, therefore, for you have seen me one myself, I dedicate the story of Corporal Connell, Captain Bellingham, the General, Raffles, and myself. I must be vague, for obvious reasons. The troop is fighting as I write. You will soon hear why I am not, but neither is Raffles nor Corporal Connell. They are fighting as well as ever, those other hard-living, harder-dying sons of all soils, but I am not going to say where it was that we fought with them. I believe that no body of men of equal size has done half so much heroic work, but they had got themselves a bad name off the field, so to speak, and I am not going to make it worse by saddling them before the world with Raffles and myself, and that ruffian Connell. The fellow was a mongrel type, a Glasgow Irishman by birth and upbringing, but he had been in South Africa for years, and he certainly knew the country very well. This circumstance, coupled with the fact that he was a very handy man with horses, as all colonists are, had procured him the first small step from the ranks which facilitates bullying if a man be a bully by nature, and is physically fitted to be a successful one. Connell was a hulking ruffian, and in me had ideal game. The brute was offensive to me from the hour I joined. The details are of no importance, but I stood up to him at first in words, and finally for a few seconds on my feet. Then I went down like an ox, and Raffles came out of his tent. Their fight lasted 20 minutes, and Raffles was marked, but the net result was dreadfully conventional, for the bully was a bully no more, but I began gradually to suspect that he was something worse. All this time we were fighting every day, or so it seems when I look back. Never a great engagement, and yet never a day when we were wholly out of touch with the enemy. I had thus several opportunities of watching the other enemy under fire, and had almost convinced myself of the systematic harmlessness of his own shooting, when a more glaring incident occurred. One night 3 troops of our squadron were ordered to a certain point whither they had patrolled the previous week, but our own particular troop was to stay behind, and in charge of no other than the villainous corporal, both our officer and sergeant having gone into hospital with enteric. Our detention, however, was very temporary, and Connell would seem to have received the usual vague orders to proceed in the early morning to the place where the other 3 companies had camped. It appeared that we were to form an escort to 2 squadron wagons containing kits, provisions, and ammunition. Before daylight, Connell had reported his departure to the commanding officer, and we passed the outposts at grey dawn. Now, though I was perhaps the least observant person in the troop, I was not the least wide awake where Corporal Connell was concerned, and it struck me at once that we were heading in the wrong direction. My reasons are not material, but as a matter of fact, our last week's patrol had pushed its khaki tentacles both east and west, and eastward they had met with resistance so determined as to compel them to retire. Yet it was eastward that we were traveling now. I at once spurred alongside Raffles, as he rode, bronzed and bearded, with war-worn wide-awake over eyes grown keen as a hawk's, and a cutty pipe sticking straight out from his front teeth. I can see him now, so gaunt and grim and debonair. yet already with much of the nonsense gone out of him, though I thought he only smiled on my misgivings. Did he get the instructions, Bunny? Or did we? Very well then, give the devil a chance. There was nothing further to be said, but I felt more crushed than convinced. So we jogged along into broad daylight until Raffles himself gave a whistle of surprise. A white flag, Bunny, by all my gods! I could not see it. He had the longest sight in all our squadron, but in a little the fluttering emblem, which had gained such a sinister significance in most of our eyes, was patent even to mine. A little longer, and the shaggy boar was in our midst upon his shaggy pony, with a half-scared, half-incredulous look in his deep-set eyes. He was on his way to our lines with some missive, and had little enough to say to us, though frivolous and flippant questions were showered upon him from most saddles. "Any boars over there?" asked one, pointing in the direction in which we were still heading. "Shut up!" interjected Raffles in crisp rebuke. The boar looked stolid but sinister. "Any of our chaps?" added another. The boar rode on with an open grin, and the incredible conclusion of the matter was that we were actually within their lines in another hour. Saw them as large as life within a mile and a half on either side of us. And must every man of us have been taken prisoner had not every man but Connell refused to go 1 inch further, and had not the Boers themselves obviously suspected some subtle ruse as the only conceivable explanation of so madcap a maneuver. They allowed us to retire without firing a shot, and retire you may be sure we did, the Kaffirs flogging their teams in a fury of fear, and our precious corporal sullen but defiant. I have said this was the conclusion of the matter, and I blush to repeat that it practically was. Connell was indeed wheeled up before the colonel, but his instructions were not written instructions, and he lied his way out with equal hardihood and tact. "You said over there, sir," he stoutly reiterated, and the vagueness with which such orders were undoubtedly given was the saving of him for the time being. I need not tell you how indignant I felt, for one. "The fellow is a spy," I said to Raffles, with no nursery oath, as we strolled within the lines that night. He merely smiled in my face. "And have you only just found it out, Bunny?" "I have known it almost ever since we joined, but this morning I did think we had him on toast." "It's disgraceful that we had not," cried I. "He ought to have been shot like a dog." "Not so loud, Bunny, though I quite agree. But I don't regret what has happened as much as you do. Not that I am less bloodthirsty than you are in this case, but a good deal more so. Bunny, I'm mad keen on bowling him out with my own unaided hand, though I may ask you to take the wicket. Meanwhile, don't wear all your animosity upon your sleeve. The fellow has friends who still believe in him, and there is no need for you to be more openly his enemy than you were before. Well, I can only vow that I did my best to follow this sound advice, but who but a Raffles can control his every look? It was never my forte, as you know, yet to this day I cannot conceive what I did to excite the treacherous corporal's suspicions. He was clever enough, however, not to betray them, and lucky enough to turn the tables on us, as you shall hear. Bloemfontein had fallen since our arrival, but there was plenty of fight in the Free Staters still, and I will not deny that it was these gentry who were showing us the sport for which our corps came in. Constant skirmishing was our portion, with now and then an action that you would know at least by name, did I feel free to mention them. But I do not, and indeed, it is better so. I have not to describe the war even as I saw it, I am thankful to say, but only the martial story of us two, and those others of whom you wot. Corporal Connell was the dangerous blackguard you have seen. Captain Bellingham is best known for his position in the batting averages a year or two ago, and for his subsequent failure to obtain a place in any of the 5 test matches. But I only think of him as the officer who recognized Raffles. We had taken a village, making quite a little name for it and for ourselves, and in the village our division was reinforced by a fresh brigade of the Imperial troops. It was a day of rest, our first for weeks, but Raffles and I spent no small part of it in seeking high and low for a worthy means of quenching the kind of thirst which used to beset yeomen and others who had left good cellars for the veldt. The old knack came back to us both, though I believe that I alone was conscious of it at the time, and we were leaving the house, splendidly supplied, when we almost ran into the arms of an infantry officer, with a scowl upon his red-hot face and an eyeglass flaming at us in the sun. "Peter Bellingham!" gasped Raffles under his breath, and then we saluted and tried to pass on, with the bottles ringing like church bells under our khaki. But Captain Bellingham was a hard man. "What have you men been doing?" drawled he. "Nothing, sir," we protested, like innocents with an injury. "Lootin's forbidden," said he. "You had better let me see those bottles." "We are done," whispered Raffles, and straightway we made a sideboard of the stoop across which he had crept at so inopportune a moment. I had not the heart to raise my eyes again, yet it was many moments before the officer broke silence. "U.A.M. var," he murmured reverentially at last. "And Long John of Ben Nevis, the first drop that's been discovered in the whole psalm-singing show." "What lot do you two belong to?" I answered. "I must have your names." In my agitation, I gave my real one. Raffles had turned away, as though in heartbroken contemplation of our lost loot. I saw the officer studying his half-profile with an alarming face. "What's your name?" he rapped out at last. But his strange, low voice said plainly that he knew, and Raffles faced him with the monosyllable of confession and assent. I did not count the seconds until the next word, but it was Captain Bellingham who uttered it at last. "I thought you were dead." "Now you see I am not, but you are at your old games." "I am not," cried Raffles, and his tone was new to me. I have seldom heard one more indignant. "Yes," he continued, "this is loot, and the wrong unwill out. That's what you're thinking, Peter. I beg your pardon, sir, but he isn't let out in the field. We're playing the game as much as you are, old sir." The plural number caused the captain to toss me a contemptuous look. "Is this the fellow who was taken when you swam for it?" he inquired, relapsing into his drawl. Raffles said I was, and with that took a passionate oath upon our absolute rectitude as volunteers. There could be no doubting him, but the officer's eyes went back at the bottles on the stoop. "But look at those," said he, and as he looked himself, the light eye melted in his fiery face. "And I've got sparklets in my tent," he sighed. "You make it in a minute." Not a word from Raffles, and none, you may be sure, from me. Then suddenly Bellingham told me where his tent was, and, adding that our case was one for serious consideration, strode in its direction without another word until some sunlit paces separated us. "You can bring that stuff with you," he then flung over a shoulder strap, "and I advise you to put it where you had it before." A trooper saluted him some yards further on, and looked evilly at us as we followed with our loot. It was Corporal Connell of ours, and the thought of him takes my mind off the certainly gallant captain who only that day had joined our division with the reinforcements. I could not stand the man myself. He added soda water to our whiskey in his tent, and would only keep a couple of bottles when we came away. Softened by the spirit to which disuse made us all a little sensitive, our officer was soon convinced of the honest part that we were playing for once, and for 50 minutes of the hour we spent with him, he and Raffles talked cricket without a break. On parting, they even shook hands. That was Long John in the captain's head, but the snob never addressed a syllable to me. And now to the gallows bird, who was still corporal of our troop. It was not long before Raffles was to have his wish and the traitor's wicket. We had resumed our advance, or rather our humble part in the great surrounding movement then taking place, and were under pretty heavy fire once more when Connell was shot in the hand. It was a curious casualty in more than one respect, and nobody seems to have seen it happen. Though a flesh wound, it was a bloody one, and that may be why the surgeon did not at once detect those features which afterwards convinced him that the injury had been self-inflicted. It was the right hand, and until it healed the man could be of no further use in the firing line. Nor was the case serious enough for admission to a crowded field hospital. And Connell himself offered his services as custodian of a number of our horses, which we were keeping out of harm's way in a donga. They had come there in the following manner. That morning we had been heliographed to reinforce the CMR, only to find that the enemy had the range to a nicety when we reached the spot. There were trenches for us men, but no place of safety for our horses nearer than this long and narrow donga which ran from within our lines towards those of the Boers. So some of us galloped them thither, six in hand, amid the whine of shrapnel and the whistle of shot. I remember the man next me being killed by a shell with all his team, and the tangle of flying harness, torn horseflesh, and crimson khaki that we left behind us on the veldt. Also that a small red flag, ludicrously like those used to indicate a putting green, marked the single sloping entrance to the otherwise precipitous donga, which I, for one, was duly thankful to reach alive. The same evening Connell, with a few other light casualties to assist him, took over the charge for which he had volunteered, and for which he was so admirably fitted by his knowledge of horses and his general experience of the country. Nevertheless, he managed to lose 3 or 4 fine chargers in the course of the first night, and early in the second, Raffles shook me out of a heavy slumber in the trenches where we had been firing all day. "I have found the spot, Bunny," he whispered. "We ought to out him before the night is over." "Connell?" Raffles nodded. "You know what happened to some of his horses last night? Well, he let them go himself." "Never." "I'm as certain of it," said Raffles, "as though I'd seen him do it, and if he does it again, I shall see him. I can even tell you how it happened. Connell insisted on having one end of the donga to himself, and of course his end is the one nearest the Boers. Well then, he tells the other fellows to go to sleep at their end. I have it direct from one of them, and you bet they don't need a second invitation. The rest I hope to see tonight." "It seems almost incredible," said I. "Not more so than the light horseman's dodge of poisoning the troughs. That happened at Ladysmith before Christmas, and 2 kind friends did for that blackguard what you and I are going to do for this one, and a firing party did the rest. Brutes! A mounted man's worth a file on foot in this country, and well they know it. But this beauty goes one better than the poison. That was willful waste, but I'll eat my wide awake if our loss last night wasn't the enemy's double gain. What we've got to do, Bunny, is to catch him in the act. It may mean watching him all night, but was ever game so well worth the candle? One may say in passing that at this particular point of contact, the enemy were in superior force, and for once in a mood as aggressive as our own. They were led with a dash and handled with a skill which did not always characterize their commanders at this stage of the war. Their position was very similar to ours, and indeed we were to spend the whole of next day in trying with an equal will to turn each other out. The result will scarcely be forgotten by those who recognize the occasion from these remarks. Meanwhile, it was the eve of battle. Most evenings were. And there was that villain with the horses in the donga, and here were we two upon his track. Raffles's plan was to reconnoiter the place, and then take up a position from which we could watch our man and pounce upon him if he gave us cause. The spot that we eventually chose and stealthily occupied was behind some bushes through which we could see down into the donga. There were the precious horses, and there sure enough was our wounded corporal, sitting smoking in his cloak, some glimmering thing in his lap. "That's his revolver, and it's a Mauser," whispered Raffles. "He shan't have a chance of using it on us. Either we must be on him before he knows we are anywhere near, or simply report. It's easily proved once we are sure, but I should like to have the taking of him too." There was a setting moon. Shadows were sharp and black. The man smoked steadily, and the hungry horses did what I never saw horses do before. They stood and nibbled at each other's tails. I was used to sleeping in the open, under the jeweled dome that seems so much vaster and grander in these wide spaces of the earth. I lay listening to the horses, and to the myriad small, strange voices of the veldt, to which I cannot even now put a name, while Raffles watched. "One head is better than two," he said, "when you don't want it to be seen. We were to take watch and watch about, however, and the other might sleep if he could. It was not my fault that I did nothing else. It was Raffles who could trust nobody but himself, nor was there any time for recriminations when he did rouse me in the end. But a moment ago, as it seemed to me, I had been gazing upward at the stars and listening to the dear, minute sounds of peace. And in another the great grey slate was clean, and every bone of me set in plaster of Paris, and sniping beginning between pickets with the day. It was an occasional crack, not a constant crackle, but the whistle of a bullet as it passed us by, or a tiny transitory flame for the one bit of detail on a blue hillside, was an unpleasant warning that we too on ours were a target in ourselves. But Raffles paid no attention to their fire. He was pointing downward through the bushes to where Corporal Connell stood with his back to us, shooing a last charger out of the mouth of the donga towards the Boer trenches. "That's his third," whispered Raffles, "but it's the first I've seen distinctly, for he waited for the blind spot before the dawn. It's enough to land him, I fancy, but we mustn't lose time. Are you ready for a creep?" I stretched myself and said I was, but I devoutly wished it was not quite so early in the morning. "Like cats, then, till he hears, and then into him for all we're worth." He stowed his iron safe away, but he mustn't have time even to feel for it. "You take his left arm, Bunny, and hang on to that like a ferret, and I'll do the rest. Ready? Then now," and in less time than it would take to tell, we were over the lip of the donga, and had fallen upon the fellow before he could turn his head. Nevertheless, for a few instants he fought like a wild beast, striking, kicking, and swinging me off my feet as I obeyed my instructions to the letter, and stuck to his left like a leech. But he soon gave that up, panting and blaspheming, demanded explanations in his hybrid tongue that had half a brogue and half a burr. What were we doing? What had he done? Raffles at his back, with his right wrist twisted round and pinned into the small of it, soon told him that, and I think the words must have been the first intimation that he had as to who his assailants were. "So it's you two," he cried, and a light broke over him. He was no longer trying to shake us off, and now he dropped his curses also, and stood chuckling to himself instead. "Well," he went on, "you're bloody liars both, but I know something else that you are, so you'd better let go." A coldness ran through me, and I never saw Raffles so taken aback. His grip must have relaxed for a fraction of time, for our captive broke out in a fresh and desperate struggle, but now we pinned him tighter than ever, and soon I saw him turning green and yellow with the pain. "You're breaking my wrist," he yelled at last. "Then stand still and tell us who we are." And he stood still and told us our real names, but Raffles insisted on hearing how he had found us out, and smiled as though he had known what was coming when it came. I was dumbfounded. The accursed hound had followed us that evening to Captain Bellingham's tent, and his undoubted cleverness in his own profession of spy had done the rest. "And now you'd better let me go," said the master of the situation, as I for one could not help regarding him. "I'll see you damned," said Raffles savagely. "Then you're damned and done for yourself, my cocky criminal. Raffles the burglar, Raffles the society thief, not dead after all, but live and listed. Send him home and give him 14 years, and won't he like 'em, that's all." "I shall have the pleasure of hearing you shot first," retorted Raffles through his teeth, "and that alone will make them bearable. Come on, Bunny, let's drive the swine along and get it over." And drive him we did, he cursing, cajoling, struggling, gloating, and blubbering by turns. But Raffles never wavered for an instant, though his face was tragic, and it went to my heart, where that look stays still. I remember at the time, though I never let my hold relax, there was a moment when I added my entreaties to those of our prisoner. Raffles did not even reply to me. But I was thinking of him, I swear. I was thinking of that gray, set face that I never saw before or after. "Your story will be tested," said the commanding officer, when Connell had been marched to the guard tent. "Is there any truth in his?" "It is perfectly true, sir." "And the notorious Raffles has been alive all these years, and you are really he?" "I am, sir." "And what are you doing at the front?" Somehow I thought that Raffles was going to smile, but the grim set of his mouth never altered. Neither was there any change in the ashy pallor which had come over him in the donga when Connell mouthed his name. It was only his eyes that lighted up at the last question. "I am fighting, sir," said he, as simply as any subaltern in the army. The commanding officer inclined a grizzled head perceptibly, and no more. He was not one of any school, our general. He had his own ways, and we loved both him and them, and I believe that he loved the rough but gallant corps that bore his name. He once told us that he knew something about most of us, and there were things that Raffles had done of which he must have heard. But he only moved his grizzled head. "Did you know he was going to give you away?" he asked at length, with a jerk of it toward the guard tent. "Yes, sir." "But you thought it worth while, did you?" "I thought it necessary, sir." The general paused, drumming on his table, making up his mind. Then his chin came up with the decision that we loved in him. "I shall sift all this," said he. "An officer's name was mentioned, and I shall see him myself. Meanwhile, you had better go on fighting." Corporal Connell paid the penalty of his crime before the sun was far above the hill held by the enemy. There was abundance of circumstantial evidence against him, besides the direct testimony of Raffles and myself, and the wretch was shot at last with little ceremony and less shrift. And that was the one good thing that happened on the day that broke upon us hiding behind the bushes overlooking the donga. By noon it was my own turn. I have avoided speaking of my wound before I need, and from the preceding pages you would not gather that I am more or less lame for life. You will soon see now why I was in no hurry to recall the incident. I used to think of a wound received in one's country's service as the proudest trophy a man could acquire, but the sight of mine depresses me every morning of my life. It was due for one thing to my own slow eye for cover, in taking which, to aggravate my case, our hardy little corps happened to excel. The bullet went clean through my thigh, drilling the bone, but happily missing the sciatic nerve. Thus the mere pain was less than it might have been, but of course I went over in a light brown heap. We were advancing on our stomachs to take the hill, and thus extend our position, and it was at this point that the fire became too heavy for us, so that for hours, in the event, we moved neither forward nor back. But it was not a minute before Raffles came to me through the whistling scud, and in another I was on my back behind a shallow rock, with him kneeling over me and unrolling my bandage in the teeth of that murderous fire. It was on the knees of the gods, he said, when I begged him to bend lower, but for the moment I thought his tone as changed as his face had been earlier in the morning. To oblige me, however, he took more care, and when he had done all that one comrade could for another, he did avail himself of the cover he had found for me. So there we lay together on the veldt, under blinding sun and withering fire, and I suppose it is the veldt that I should describe, as it swims and flickers before wounded eyes. I shut mine to bring it back, but all that comes is the keen brown face of Raffles, still a shade paler than its wont, now bending to sight and fire, now peering to see results, brows raised, eyes widened, anon turning to me with the word to set my tight lips grinning. He was talking all the time, but for my sake, and I knew it. Can you wonder that I could not see an inch beyond him? He was the battle to me then. He is the whole war to me as I look back now. Feel equal to a cigarette? It will buck you up, Bunny. No, that one in the silver paper, I've hoarded it for this. Here's a light, and so Bunny takes the Sullivan. All honor to the sporting rabbit. At least I went over like one, said I, sending the only clouds into the blue, and chiefly wishing for their longer endurance. I was as hot as a cinder from my head to one foot. The other leg was ceasing to belong to me. Wait a bit, says Raffles, puckering. There's a gray felt hat at deep long on, and I want to add it to the bag for vengeance. Wait. Yes, no luck. I must pitch, em up a bit more. Hello, magazine empty. How goes the Sullivan, Bunny? Rum to be smoking one on the veldt with a hole in your leg. It's doing me good, I said, and I believe it was. But Raffles lay looking at me as he lightened his bandolier. Do you remember, he said softly, the day we first began to think about the war? I can see the pink misty river light, and feel the first bite there was in the air when one stood about. Don't you wish we had either here? Orful slaughter. That fellow's face, I see it too. And here we have the thing he cried. Can you believe it's only 6 months ago? Yes, I sighed, enjoying the thought of that afternoon less than he did. Yes, we were slow to catch fire at first. Too slow, he said quickly, but when we did catch, I went on, wishing we never had, we soon burnt up, and then went out, laughed Raffles gaily. He was loaded up again. Another over at the gray felt hat, said he. By Jove, though, I believe he's having an over at me. I wish you'd be careful, I urged. I heard it too. My dear Bunny, it's on the knees you wot of. If anything's down in the specifications, surely that is. Besides, that was nearer. To you? No, to him. Poor devil, he has his specifications too. It's comforting to think that. I can't see where that one pitched. It may have been a wide, and it's very nearly the end of the over again. Feeling worse, Bunny? No, I've only closed my eyes. Go on talking. It was I who let you in for this, he said, at his bandolier again. No, I'm glad I came out, and I believe I still was, in a way, for it was rather fine to be wounded just then, with the pain growing less. But the sensation was not to last me many minutes, and I can truthfully say that I have never felt it since. Ah, but you haven't had such a good time as I have. Perhaps not. Had his voice vibrated, or had I imagined it? Pain waves and loss of blood were playing tricks with my senses. Now they were quite dull, and my leg alive and throbbing. Now I had no leg at all, but more than all my ordinary senses in every other part of me. And the devil's orchestra was playing all the time and all around me, on every class of fiendish instrument which you have been made to hear for yourselves in every newspaper. Yet all that I heard was Raffles talking. I have had a good time, Bunny. Yes, his voice was sad, but that was all. The vibration must have been in me. I know you have, old chap, said I. I am grateful to the General for giving me today. It may be the last. Then I can only say it's been the best. By Jove! What is it? And I opened my eyes. His were shining. I can see them now. Got him. Got the hat. No, I'm hanged if I have. At least he wasn't in it. The crafty cuss. He must have stuck it up on purpose. Another over. Scoring slow. I wonder if he's sportsman enough to take a hint. His hat-trick's foolish. Will he show his face if I show mine? I lay with closed ears and eyes. My leg had come to life again, and the rest of me was numb. Bunny! His voice sounded higher. He must have been sitting upright. Well? But it was not well with me. That was all I thought as my lips made the word. It's not only been the best time I ever had, old Bunny, but I'm not half sure of what I can but guess. The sentence was not finished, and never could be in this world.